resolution beyond that of eyes open seeing. But it's not normal that we see like we see in the dream with the eyes open. So I wanted to make this quality of light to be like it was when seen in the dream. Now, in terms of spirit and religion, if you think of Saul on the road to Damascus and this vision and light, this is described in a vocabulary of light. Or Buddha achieving enlightenment, you also have this idea where this luminous void is spoken of. Here's a piece that I actually do have that. You're in this, bathed in this one kind of light, and then you step up to that seeming wall, and it's a deep space that is, again, filled with another light. So this idea of actually having consciousness go into spaces that are light-filled was very much like what is described in also a near-death experience as well. All these experiences, whether it's Saul or whether it's achieving samadhi or whether it is a near-death experience, are often described about using a vocabulary of light. So this is something that artists have been using for a long time. Certainly religions have used artists. Italy is a great place for that. You see how many paintings and how much art was really subsidized by the church. This isn't unusual. The first artist to be mentioned is Bezalel in the Bible, where Bezalel was the one who was commissioned to make the first tabernacle and decorate it, and also made the Ark of the Covenant. So artists have been involved in all these levels of society, and light has this action or payout in all these three levels of body and mind and spirit. So I wanted to work with this material, light, in this way. Now generally, in working with light, we've tended to use light to illuminate other things. But I wanted to have the thingness of light itself. So therefore, in doing this, it wasn't something that would be at all referential to other things. It had to be the light that we were looking at, so that light itself became the revelation. This is a later piece where light actually takes form out in space, relates to some of the early shallow space constructions, but is made with LED. Another thing of the same piece. And then the exciting thing for me was to get not only it contained in a space, like a resonance cavity, but to try to project it out so that it seemed as though light made planes and volumes would begin behind a plane. This is a space, the dark space, the red space at the back actually can be walked through. And in the early pieces I did, I actually allowed people to walk through those spaces, which went fine at the early work I did at the Stedelijk Museum in Amsterdam. But when I brought the show to the Whitney Museum in New York, I had one of these pieces, and a woman leaned back against it and fell. Unfortunately, she was the wife of the Chief Justice of the State Supreme Court of Oregon, and so she brought suit against me for falling. She did, as she fell to the floor, she put her arm down and broke her wrist. Now, her testimony was there was this wall. Actually, it was a receding wall. I leaned against it, and it wasn't there. Actually, I lost the first case, which was difficult. So for many years, and I no longer showed this kind of work in America. I would only show up in Europe and Asia. But it was a difficult time for me, and really reordered a lot of my thinking about the audience, because there is this strange thing about audience. In many cases, we think that there are, at least I would imagine, this idealized person who is looking at my work, which sometimes I could be myself, but not always, because sometimes in the trouble of making work, I would, well, you know, if you have a hard time getting a show up, you're just happy to get to the opening and get out of there. So I don't know that I even saw all of my own work as this idealized viewer. But this was a difficult time to realize that sometimes people saw things quite differently. I thought I had an idea of how people perceived, but obviously this wasn't the case. There were three Americans who actually did this. Only one sued, but that was the show at the Whitney. So this was a difficult time for me. I was even sued for the lack of conjugal services. This is referring to a husband and wife having sex. And I, at the time, she had only broken her wrist, so I thought it must have been a hell of a hand job. At any rate, when I when I went to, from that period, I went back to Arizona, sort of crawled back into my hole, and then just began to do this series of works, which actually, again, this idea of the cave, where you know, we are sort of soul housed in body, and then we are self-embodied in structure that we create. This idea that we enclose ourselves in these sort of caves. Now, this is completely closed off to the outside world, and I was interested in how we would open onto that. So I began cutting holes, and the first piece I did was for Ponza di Buomo in Varese, Italy, where I cut out the ceiling and roof and made the sky seem to come down to the top of it. In these pieces, this one here now shows you what it is. This is sort of halfway through sunset, and the sky that's really always out there, somewhere away from you, is brought down into close contact with the space that you're in by virtue of how you equalize the light inside in relationship to the light outside. And so these pieces I began to do, and eventually, after a series of these spaces, I realized that not every place, not every museum was happy to have you cut a hole in the roof. Which I did do at, say, PS1 or with Ponza's piece, and you can still see those pieces today. But what I began to do is I realized I needed to make the building myself that the hole had already been cut in. So that, of course, then tends toward architecture. And while I still believe myself to be an artist making these useless spaces, I did have to begin to do the form that contained this thing that I was doing. Here's Boulet's eye. Now Boulet was one of the sort of fantastic or idealistic architects. Often didn't build too many things. But I began to do pieces that were outside and actually had an outside, were form, and were in that way architecture, still while dealing with this inside to outside, like Meister Eckhart would say, totus intus, totus deforis. This idea of inside to outside. And this is very interesting in how it relates also to Plato, in the sense of what we are perceiving, we are indeed creating. That is, we create the reality in which we live, and we're often quite unaware of how we do that. We're quite unaware of the fact that, first of all, we color the sky. We award it its color through the context of vision. And it's very possible for me to change that. So I can actually change the color of the sky. Now, in going from this idea of now, because I had difficulty cutting holes in people's museums, I began to make more of these structures myself. My family was Quaker, conservative Quaker. The liberal Quakers are quite interested in having me make their meeting houses. Now, this is the first one I made. I've made a second one. This is in Houston, Texas. The second one is near Philadelphia, and I'm doing one up in Mount Desert Island in Maine. But one of the things I can remember is my grandmother would talk to me about this going inside to greet the light. This idea of the beginning of the spinther or the bindu, or this spot of light that would begin almost as a visual mantra that you would see at the beginning of meditation after you had taken 5 or 10 minutes to get rid of the images and thoughts of outside, and that you would go inside to greet this light. So this light inside often refers to this light that we have, that we carry. And it was a long time because before I would go into the regular meeting when I was young, because the conservative Quakers would often sit over 2 hours. And that was kind of a long time for young people, at least I thought. But in there I would often imagine what I would like to have this meeting be like. And so the piece at PS1, the one I did at PS1 is called Meeting, in fact, where I made sort of the seating foursquare around it, as the Quakers would sit, as you see here, because they have no direction. There's no priesthood, there's no altar, there are no symbols. And so I would think of how I would like to have a meeting house, and so I thought of it sort of almost like a convertible, that the ceiling would pull back and it would open up to the physical heavens above. Anyway, that's how I've made these pieces here, and I've done them now for the Quakers, but not for the Quakers at my family. The conservative Quakers are sort of not interested in this idea. And here we have a piece called Big Red, and this is actually what your eye sees. And I want to tell you that we have these cameras that see for us. They don't always see as we see, because the next picture is how this scene would be seen by the camera. The next one. It's possible, actually, that not always does light reveal. Light often can obscure. The greatest example of this is when sunlight lights the atmosphere. We can't see through the atmosphere to see the stars that are there. Now, this also can be true even on stage in small spaces. That is, light can obscure vision. For instance, if you have the footlights here on stage and the stage lighting and the audience light is down, often the performers cannot see the audience at all. So you're in the same architectural physical space, but in completely different visual spaces. So that realization meant that I could actually make space, make form, without any physical thing other than light. Now, you have to remember that in talking about light, light is a physical thing that does exhibit wave phenomena. But if you read QED by Richard Feynman, you'll realize that it is a thing. But we don't necessarily see it as a thing. But this idea to relate the seen with the unseen, the immaterial or the material with the immaterial, and sort of earth with the cosmos was something that was kind of gaining a little momentum in my work and in my mind about how to do these works. Here is a tunnel that's at the Houston Museum of Fine Art. I also did tunnels in Munich, Germany for Munich Reinsurance, or Munich Re. And one of the problems with space, and this is also true in an elevator, is that often we get this feeling of claustrophobia because we feel confined. I mean, obviously, if you think about it, you're in an elevator that's in a big building, that's in a large city, that's in this big space. But we feel confined because we have lost cues to things beyond. So one of the ways to do that is certainly through sound. You probably have been in an apartment where you put on a record of some symphony and suddenly the room is bigger than the physical room. You actually really feel to be in that. So the rational sort of physical reality isn't the only reality within which we exist. We create this reality over it, and it's easy to make that through cues, both in light. Here, this is in a very narrow tunnel. This is actually this is an underground pool here that I've made in Connecticut. So it's possible to actually make very large spaces out of spaces that are seemingly small. This is some more of this